Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to the session. As you make your way down the stairs, I am going to start with the introduction. Oi! There we go. That's what I usually do in this room. Thank you. Good morning. We're going to start with the introduction of our very last Keynote speaker for this Congress. Can you believe it? I'm running out of orange t-shirts, so it's about time. I thought I could go one of two ways. The first one was to basically repeat all the info you have on the app and surely somewhere on Google already on Kobus Marais' extensive publication record, his groundbreaking research and so forth. But I thought since on the last morning of a conference, we're typically a slightly more intimate group, I would perhaps share something more personal with you. I think each of us has our own journey with translation studies, and in mine I've been very privileged to come into contact with some of the best older thinkers and contemporary thinkers of our field. I specifically remember the first time I read the Hungarian Levy's The Art of Translation in English translation, and it completely blew my mind to see it in English. I remember a very entertaining interview I had with Christiane Nord as a part of my master's degree. I remember the first time Anthony Pym told me that my initial idea for the PhD isn't a PhD idea at all. But then I remember something very specifically, and that's the first time I sat in a conference paper and I could really feel the fact that this guy was tugging at the very fabric of what we think we know about what we're doing in this field, about what we think we know about the construction of meaning. And I especially remember quite a heated exchange I had with him afterwards, after referring to him as a post-structuralist. That didn't go down well. He can defend himself against that accusation again this morning. But ladies and gentlemen, you can check out his CV on your own. It's most impressive. But in my view, one of the top thinkers in our field, in the world today, and certainly a true South African and a true African considering what he does for translation studies in Africa. I am very privileged to present to you my friend Professor Kobus Marais.
Thanks, Marius. We have an anecdote in our family about a really useless man who was philandering his way through life, moving between jobs, and whenever he had money he would drink it or gamble it out, hit the wife on his way to bed, kick the dog and the children, and so it happened that at some point he passed away. And because they've moved around so much, they were in a little town where he wasn't well known, and the minister had nothing else to do but to say, you know, at the graveyard, this dearly beloved brother that we have come to bury here today, he was a real family man who cared for his family and his children, and you know, he was a pillar of society, and he never sent his children home to bed hungry. And then at some point, one of the little 6-year-old, his daughter, tucked the sleeve of the mum and said, "Mum, let's go home. It's not our dad that's being buried here today." So I'm not sure whether you are attending the right funeral today, but it has to go on. I just first want to thank the EST powers. I'm not sure whether you call yourself a board, powers, and the scientific committee specifically for inviting me, putting me up in a fancy hotel where I have a nice little fresh chocolate each night. That's really very special. Thank you for all the arrangements, and thank you for having me. Then I just also want to say, I think I want to dedicate this lecture to all my colleagues in our department, to all the postdocs and the research associates that are linked to our department. They will know of the hard times that we have been through. And this one is for you guys. Thanks for all the support. So when I decided on the title, I chose it probably for rhetorical reasons. Nice alliteration, but my main idea was to talk about process, and afterwards only I thought translating time could be seen from three perspectives. And assuming that you will also pick this up, I just want to say I'm probably not going into one of them specifically. They're all sort of there. So it could be seen as now is translating time. That's a possible interpretation. It could be that time is the one translating, like water, running water, so water is running. So time could be doing the translation, and I think that's possible. Or it could be that we are translating time, and that might also be possible. So I'm not choosing any of these or going specifically into any of these. Sorry, before I start, I'm just reminded, I have a number of videos. If there are people with, I was reminded, if there are people with visual issues for watching videos, please know that I've warned you if you cannot watch a video on a screen. They are quite stable, I think, but yeah, I was just asked to say that. So I think it is fair to say that translation has always been considered in some way or another as a process. And roughly speaking, I think there are three strands that one could say is process thinking in translation studies. That would be something like the cognitive communication, hermeneutic, process thinking that Roger Bell is probably most famous for, and which flowed over into modern cognitive or the recent cognitive studies. Then very recent neurology and neurocognitive studies. And also the sociology of translation, I think, considers translation as a process. The problem I see, however, is that translation is probably mostly, not necessarily in total, but probably mostly considered or conceptualized as a spatial process. And I will show you some models in a while where the carrying over metaphor dominates our thinking. So we tend to model or think about translation quite spatially, I think. And if we claim from a complexity angle that complex adaptive systems are processes, I think we can delve deeper into the process nature, broadly speaking, of translation. Another problem, I think, is that the materiality of what we have to model with constrains our modeling. So if you have a page, you cannot have animation on a printed page. So that means that you are limited in how you can model translation. And I think that has been a problem for us. This came up, for instance, in 2017 when we had a complexity conference, that we spoke about complexity, but all the models we put on the screen were very static kind of models. So I think my core interest here would be linking translation studies and process philosophy, which I think is a process that is taking place anyway with the two authors and most probably some more. But what I want to do specifically is to ask the following question. What are the implications of the second law of thermodynamics for sociocultural reality? So the second law of thermodynamics is actually not a law, as in Newtonian law, but more a tendency. And that is the insight that all of reality tends towards equilibrium, tends towards stasis. tends to become flat, right? So if you have a heater in this part of the room and that part of the room is cold, the tendency would be for the localized heat to spread out so that the whole of the temperature in the room becomes equal, becomes in an equilibrium. And this is what is called entropy. So that is, I've marked it here with a plus equilibrium. So this is reality tends towards these stable states. In physics, the opposite of that, which is neg entropy or negative entropy, is also well known. But negative entropy never happens naturally. It always requires work, whether that is work from humans in our case, but also work from natural systems. So natural systems, the kind of ecology that Professor Mitchell discussed the other night, that's the weather is caused by systems working on systems to create negative entropy and to create the emergence of clouds. So if that is the way all reality is, and if for the sake of our argument we do not call on supernatural causes to explain why this is so, but we want to find an internal in reality cause for this, the question then is, what is the relationship between process, time, and work? And that is what I would briefly want to talk about. So, in most of our thinking, in the West at least, substance thinking dominates. We tend to think of substances. So if we think of talking, we think words, or we think texts, or we think discourses. We tend to think more in terms of substance, while if we look at the Peircean conception of meaning, he says that meaning is, in its primary acceptation, the translation of a sign into another system of signs. So Peirce says no sign has meaning. There is no meaning in a sign. Meaning is always a process. It's only when a sign is being worked upon, is in a process of being changed, being reworked, that it becomes meaningful. In another quote, I've colored the verbs, which I think denotes process and meaning, in green, and then in red is claim that this keeps on potentially ad infinitum. Semiotic process is a never-ending process which for the individual stops at death. Anthony Pym has written about, for the translation project, it stops at the deadline. So we make it stop, but it carries on beyond our stoppings. So I wanted then to explain translation as this meaning-making process in terms that agree with the second law of thermodynamics, because I want a unified kind of thinking between natural and human sciences. And therefore I've conceptualized translation as the work that we perform on semiotic material in order to create meaning. So I don't ascribe to the Turi definitions, the Timosco definitions, etc. For me, translation taken from Peirce is the work that is performed on semiotic material. Now, work means that to perform work, you need to have a differential of energy. So if the air in this room is stable of temperature, it will just stay here. It's only if we can heat this part up, the air would rise and cold air would flow. So it's only when there's a differential of energy that things start happening. So the best example for this is the workings of a pump. You took just normal air, take normal air, with which you can't do anything. You build constraints, namely a cylinder and valves. You put the air inside, or it puts itself inside, and by pressing on it, you create a differential between the pressure inside the pump and the pressure outside the pump. And then you can use that to pump a balloon or a tire or whatever you want to pump. But the point is, this is the imposition of constraints. You need constraints for this. So for me, translation entails imposing constraints, meaning limiting the possibilities of what meaning there could be on semiotic stuff in order to create meaning. So the implications then is that we probably need to think of time as more basic than space, in the sense that there could be time without space, but could there be anything spatial without there having been a process before that? At least, if we don't want to settle that debate, we could hold on to a complex view and say that whenever we think, we should think space and time, or time and space. So, for me, reality is basically not matter, but energy, and energy as a process of continuously being organized. So if you think quantum physics, or if you think Big Bang, initially there is nothing but energy and constellations of energy that gets organized into patterns which become form. So reality, according to Whitehead, is a process of coming into being, of taking shape or form. And the question now is, so what is the relationship between process and form, or structure, or substance? Or how does processes take form? If we say that process is what drives the emergence of society, of reality, where do forms come from? Where do the stable things that we see come from? And the argument goes that it is the process itself that creates structure through the imposition of constraints. So this is probably a form of new structuralism, if you want to call it that, but where the structure is not presupposed. The structure is emergent. The structure of meaning is emergent out of the historical process. And that is why Jacques Kairos could say that in intersemiotic translation in which he works, we are dealing with multi-level hierarchical semiotic systems or complex adaptive systems that are constraining processes. So it's continuously a process of constraining the possibilities that are possible in semiotic material. So I quickly want to wrap this part up by drawing some implications just generally. I think in our case we should think about source text and target text themselves as processes. And for that I've tried to coin time-related terms, namely incipient and subsequent signs. And Chuang, as yesterday, beautifully demonstrated how a subsequent sign in one system could become an incipient sign in another system. So you have a really complex causality at work here. So what do we translate? I don't think we translate meaning. I think we translate patterns of constraints, like a genre. I think this is quite close to the functionalist ideas about translation. So there is no meaning somewhere. Meaning is a process that emerges out of the constraints that work on that process, which means that there isn't a meaning that we can translate. There's only the patterns of constraints that we can replicate or change or do something with, whatever we want to do with it. So basically then we work on patterns of constraints under patterns of constraints. So it's a complex causality once again. We do not translate substances or meanings, but relations between streams of meaning or between patterns. And this means that all social cultural artifacts emerge through translation processes. Not only written texts, not only spoken texts, but this building has a translational dimension to it. There was some semiotic work that went into this. Obviously stone and mortar and all these kinds of things. So this isn't a translation, and I don't think there are things that are translations. There are only things that have translational aspects to them, and we can study that. Because translation is the work that we do, and we can study that work. I want to highlight in the context just 2 or 3 things for the Global South, generally for Africa and particularly. I think this means that we can study the particular development trajectories or the tendencies in a society as a process of meaning making, as a process which is constrained by ideas, as cultural studies tell us, but also by the materiality of the conditions. In a desert, you cannot do what you can do in a well-rained place. It's a set of constraints that limit also, I think, our translational activities. We could ask, linking this to the functionalist kind of thinking, what semiotic work is or was done by whom, where, when, to create this particular phenomenon that we are studying. In developing contexts where existing practices and new imported developing practices are usually at loggerheads with one another, we could have the what is and the what could or what should be as aspects of meaning that can be negotiated in a developing context. And I think it could help us participate in the emergence of our continent. So I need to move on. The question is now how to model this. Because the models we have cannot do this up to now. So in translation studies, we have usually used metaphors to model our thought. And that's good and well, but the problem with metaphor is that anything can be anything else, metaphorically speaking. And I don't want to go there, it's too vague, it generally doesn't help me to think. So once again, I delved into a bit of Peirce that I know, and he has a whole section of his thought on what he calls diagrammatical reasoning. So the argument is that iconic signs represent some of the qualities of the objects that they refer to, and this is perceivable by sensorially perceivable and graspable, and this helps us to think through some conceptual symbolic problems that we might have. So what you do with a diagram is you present the internal structure, the set of constraints of the problem that you are dealing with, you represent that in diagrammatic form, and I will show you some examples. And then you can manipulate the diagram. You can, like with Pythagoras' theorem, you can make some sides longer, some sides shorter, see how that influences the problem. In a very recent article, Champagne beautifully wrote that visual elements, diagrams, pictures could be propositions, but they cannot be arguments because there's no movement in them. So if you want to use visuals to make an argument, if you want to make diagrammatical arguments, you have to have visuals that move. And this is exactly what I'm going to try to do. According to Peirce, you take 2 steps when you do diagrammatical reasoning. The first is what he calls precision. So you decide on, you analytically extract notions that you want to think about. And for today, I want to talk about, or want to think about diagrammatically process, time, complex themes of meaning, emergent, incipient, and subsequent systems, infinite semiosis, and difference or similarity. So once you've done that, you do what he called hypostatic abstraction, and that is turning the predicate into a subject and try to manipulate that. So this would typically be, translation is process. Then you take the process, which was the predicate, you turn it into the subject and say, process entails time, and you try to model that. Or translation is emergent process, and you turn the predicate into a subject and you say emergent process takes form. I have 3 sets of data for you. The first is some models on paper, which models translation in 2 dimensions. Then I have models that I've worked on over the past 6 years or so in static software, and they are still 2-dimensional, with some of them giving a 3-dimensional illusion. And then I have 3 little animated videos which I designed with an animation designer. And they are 2-dimensional with the illusion of 3 or 4 dimensions. I don't want to go into the ontology of that, it's too complicated. So this is typically from Roger Bell. This is typical of the 1990s kind of modeling. So there is no time there's no time flow here. You can see the whole thing at one glance. It represents process, but it represents process spatially, not in time. So it still does not do what we have to translate time into space before we can do this kind of thing. So then I started thinking, I initially used circles embedded in one another with dotted lines sort of giving the idea of permeability between systems, but this is still very static. And I made complicated ones of this, still very static. And then I started thinking, well, let's think really out of the box. And I did this, right? So I used a squiggly line. Oh, now I pressed the wrong button. I use the squiggly lines to indicate the process. So this is still stable, but the squiggly line represents the process, but still, it's spatial. You can see it at once. You don't have to wait for anything to happen. You can see it at once. Inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, I did this rhizome model. So a rhizome is a biological term for a plant system like fungi, which is a flat system where everything is connected to everything. It's not a hierarchical system. Right, so I thought, well, let's take the Persian triad, connect it in something like a spider web, but still it is straight lines, it's spatial, doesn't work. Then in my dealings with Caroline Mangerel and her husband, who's a microbiologist, they suggested this, the triple helix of DNA, and I still think this is a really strong model if we can get it to move, which I couldn't yet, but imagine these 3 strands moving and out of them branching streams ad infinitum. And that becomes, I think, a fantastic translation model. Then I hired Picasso to draw me artwork. This was for the 2017 presentation. This is my own efforts. So what I did here is I used fluid mechanics to think about translation. So you have various streams. In this example, I used the children's rhyme, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So you would have the rhythm of it, you would have awe about up above, you would have rhyme, you would have the stars. They all flow together in an incipient sign, which is a little eddy that emerges, and they flow on into a subsequent sign. Now, if you translate, maybe you do an Afrikaans translation for your Sunday school, you bring in God into this, but God wasn't in that incipient sign system. It's only in the secondary one. And some of the things that were in the incipient sign system, like sky, you can bypass the system, so it doesn't get into the translation. These are all things that we know, but this was a way of modeling it, but still, spatial, static, doesn't show you any movement. So, this is where the fun begins. I just need to go here so that I can control the times. So I'm first going to play you the whole thing, and then I will move it back and explain some of it. So I asked animation expert to help me with this, and this is what he came up with. Right? So, to explain in terms of the 6 elements that I presented. These sources emerge out of nowhere. They weren't there when the animation began. They could be books, the internet, other people, whatever, any kind of media. So here, you cannot see the whole process. So this modeling forces you to think about time, because you cannot see the whole process in one view. You have to wait to see what is going to happen next. And that exactly is process, and that exactly is the implication of time. You also see complex streams, so they color differently, and they have different trajectories. So they're not the same, they don't have the same influence. If we then take this further, you can see there a pattern emerges as an incipient sign. It doesn't have the same pattern than here. And there's your translation, which is another incipient, another sign. And it doesn't look like the original. And the process continues on and flows into wherever it flows. So that's my electromagnetic example. Also tried one with fluid mechanics. And this does basically the same, just with water. Oh, wrong one. What's happening here? This one? So these are rivers. These are trees. So it's a top view of rivers, water flow. There is your source text. There's your translator. And there's your target text in our parlance. Right? So what we have here again is a process. You don't see the whole thing in one. You have to wait. Right? Just to move it on quickly. So, what is important is to see how the 4 colors here mix into emerging patterns which were not here. So, in this way, I model translation as emerging pattern. The same here. there's a similarity. It's the same colors, but they're not in the same order. They're not in the same patterns, right? To try to demonstrate this, and then obviously the process continues ad infinitum. I want to move to the right. So the issue here then is that with these models I could model time. I could model process, I could model complex streams, I could model emerging patterns, infinite semiosis, and differences and similarities, but they were all still two-dimensional. And I was wondering whether one could do a three-dimensional one. So I went back to Floyd Merrill's work, where he used the Mobius strip and linked that to Persian semiotics. So here's the Persian triad. And he basically suggested that if we link these two concepts together, we get a never-ending process out of this, because a Mobius strip is a strip of paper which you cut, you form a circle, and then you turn the one side 180 degrees. And if you hold them together, you can draw one line continuously on both sides of the paper without ever stopping. So you get a continuous process out of this. He transposed this into what is called the Penrose diagram, which is a three-dimensional, a Penrose triangle, which is a three-dimensional triangle, which do exactly the same. You can move on levels. If you move on, you go at the back, you move on that level, then at the back you move on that level, and you move on different levels without stopping ever. It's like the Escher paintings, those conceptual paintings of Escher. And so he came up with something like this. This is from the crest of Isle of Man, I think. And it symbolizes never-ending movement. But still all of these are stable. So I asked my man to do this. So if I can stop it for a moment. I have a propeller with 3 blades, 3 different colors, so that's the Persian triad. It moves through time, and it creates patterns of meaning in its wake, which I think is a really nice model for a translation process. And the interesting thing is, if you stop this 1 second after the other, I'm going to do this, what you see is totally different. Oh. No, I've now clicked on the wrong place. Right? So the pattern itself comes and goes. The pattern itself isn't stable. The pattern has pattern. So there's a recognizable triadic pattern to it, but it's not stable. There, the green would be dominant, and in the next moment, the yellow and the orange would be dominant. And I think this conceptually talks to the process of meaning which changes through the work that we impose. But this is still mostly two-dimensional. I have one more. So this one moves three-dimensionally, forward, backwards, turn around, come out in another direction. It's a three-dimensional movement. And once again, the interesting thing is what we can't see while it's moving but which we see when we stop it. And that's how I think we observe in something like translation studies. We freeze processes for the moment, and then we see that kind of pattern. And a few moments later, that kind of pattern, and then that kind of pattern, and so on. So I'm closing with some implications and prospects. I think this kind of thinking requires of us to rethink stability and change. I think translation studies have worked really hard on talking about change, agency, creativity, these kinds of things. But I think we need to think as hard about explaining stability as we are working on explaining change. Because if you agree that reality is process, then the thing to explain, the thing that is new, is the stabilities that come about, not the change itself. The change is, as it were, assumed. So I'm sort of turning our thinking on its head by at least wondering whether the thing that we need to explain is not how come that the Constitution can be stamped as an exact copy, which in translation studies we love to debunk, some of us. I think the implication is, what do we translate? We translate patterns of constraints. In the incipient science system that we deal with is just a particular instantiation of a semiotic pattern that emerged through the imposition of constraints. And I think if we consider the patterns of constraints that work on semiotic material, it might help us in understanding how the stability comes to be. I think the modeling, at least for me, helps me seeing and imagining and conceptualizing process. It is, for me, maybe I'm just visually inclined, but for me it helps to see these kind of things that we usually think of in terms of stable things. We see them as processes. Obviously, this was a first effort. I think there's a lot of refining to be done. In particular, I didn't look at how to model constraints and trajectories. We had a very interesting example yesterday where I think there's still room for us to model trajectories. But so I think there's a lot of work. This is just literally a first effort at seeing what we can do. And I would suggest to people who can work with computers, who can program computers, and who have colleagues who can do that, maybe to help us with models where we can even change some of the variables and then see if the process went like this. If these were the initial conditions, what happened? And if those were the initial conditions, what happened? If we can come up with those, I think it would be really interesting. And the last thing is, and this is really for the hardcore people, would we ever be able to simulate a translation process? What I've done here is just to model my own thought process. I haven't said anything about reality yet, except my own little reality, which is in here. But so I think this is a task for the digital humanities to see, can we get computational models for this kind of thinking, and what would they look like? And one of the speakers yesterday said there was 11,000 variables identified for every translation. Can we model that? I'm not sure. That's for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kobus. It's always hard to follow on that. I think we had a masterclass in critical interrogation and not making declamatory statements. So thank you very much. It certainly is a lot of food for thought. We do have time for, let's say, one or two questions. So right in the middle, Professor Gottlieb.
Impressive, but what about the audience? What about the social realities?
Well, they are the constraints, and that's why I said these models are limited. I had to start somewhere. A year ago, I had only concepts, and it took me hours and hours of meetings with an animation specialist to convey my concepts. So yes, all the constraints need to be factored in, and if we can start doing that, so the point would be that if you can, let's say with the fluid mechanics, if you can alter the amount of water that flows, then you would see that different patterns should emerge. So that would be a simple way of modeling these kind of social factors that play a role. Or if the embankment would change, or if you would drop a stone in the river and there would another eddy would form. So yes, for sure, I haven't gone there just because it's too much to do.
Thank you very much. It sounds overwhelming being new, but at some points I remember NIDA schematic drawings of the process, and in particular Joe Steiner's description of translation as a process that leads to balance. Do you relate in any way to the forefathers of the discipline?
Probably not enough. So as I said, I acknowledge that I'm not the first person to talk about process. Definitely not. I mean, Salah is sitting here, and some other people, Douglas and Anthony has written about, and many people have written about this. And I think it's forever been there. I think what probably would be new would be the engagement with process philosophy, and with the complex adaptive systems notion of the second law of thermodynamics. So they would have had the origins of process probably elsewhere. I don't know NIDA's that part of his work at all, actually. So I will probably need to go and have a look at it. And if there are, if you see lines, then by all means there should be lines, I think.
Anthony was next.
Thank you, Kobus. I'm here because I like languages and the diversity of languages, and I like people who do things in languages. I'm sorry that people and languages are not in your model, but let's go with it, because it's nice. What makes the propellers go round, and why are the propellers in rivers? Please.
Oh. Well, firstly, I'm sorry that you feel excluded, but the model doesn't exclude language. I just need to conceptualize the non-linguistic, because the linguistic has been overly dominant, in my view, in translation studies. And the moves towards multimodal and intermedial communication, for me, is too overwhelming to ignore. So, but definitely, this does not exclude. I mean, the Picasso drawing was specifically meant for a poem translation, right? So it doesn't exclude that. Yes, like with Gottlieb's question, you're right. That would be further things to model. What makes the propeller turn? Yes, that would be further things to model. I mean, you can then say, well, the propeller would be the mind, the last one, that would be the cognitive process of the translator, or you could have social factors that impact. I mean, that's open. So it's just, I couldn't do all of this. The reason why there are propellers in the river is because the animator could not grasp or work out for me the eddy thing. Actually, the fluid mechanics one was the first one he did. And I just showed it for what he did, because he does show some things, but yes, the propellers there it should have been eddies. It should have been, yeah. So that's just, and I mean, he couldn't get that right. I just left it and showed it. I should have said that, yeah, sorry.
Okay, one last question right at the back in the middle.
Thank you. This is all very fascinating, and I really like the way that you focus on time rather than space. One short thing I'd like to say is that the first model, the electromagnetics one, really brought to mind Dr. Network theory. I mean, I can see all these parameters converging into some direction and how they correlate. And I come to my question, which harks back to your question to the first keynote with chaos. So I can see when you do science, you need to observe and kind of voice predictions, right? So I see a really complex model with a lot of parameters factoring, not necessarily it's at infinity. So are we closer to, I can see, you asked about social parameters that might be monitored or not, and the first keynote told you that society, with which I agree, is much more complex than predicting the weather. There's so many parameters to factor in that is the model sustainable is the question, and can it give you a way to observe these restrictions that would be actually serviceable to us?
Well, the first thing is, what I'm quite sure of is that we do not understand how systems with intentional actors differ from systems with non-intentional actors. And many systems theorists will say that we don't need to make a difference because systems theory is exactly an abstract, generalized kind of theory. We don't have to do that. But I'm of the persuasion that, I mean, and most of you have written about these things, that we have to talk about agents and how agents determine trajectories. I'm not yet sure whether we know. That's part of my research program that I want to find out, but I don't know at this point. I think, so part of the solution to your problem lies at the level, at choice of level of observation. So this is an overall view, but you cannot observe everything. So I've written in an article with Carmen Delgado, we've tried to work out exactly how you can choose levels of observation and then next and lower relevant levels to just start to get a handle on where you're going. And you could model this. I think there are other models also that we could do with that. So to me, whether you talk about translating a poem, designing a building, adapting a book into a movie, you could trace the complex processes. And yes, I was influenced by Latour deeply. I think that's what I'm trying to do, is to, but we cannot, where I would probably differ from him is, he would trace the ant, I would like more to trace trajectories, tendencies, emerging patterns, probably. I suppose I haven't really answered the question.
You trace trajectories, you have tendencies, you cannot, is it serviceable to observe reality is the question.
Well,
and for the record, I didn't talk about systems theory, I talked
yeah.
about acronym.
Yeah. So, if it's, is it serviceable? It's like, what else is there? Because if reality is this complex, we cannot predict. And I think social reality is inherently unpredictable, but there are probabilities, and that has been explored. So I think what we want to look at is, at a certain point, with a certain configuration of things at a certain state, certain things are more probable to happen than others. And so if we can follow, like the strange attractors, if we can say, within this range, there are a probability. But in human social science, well, I think also in quantum mechanics, you cannot exactly predict. You can only predict at the Newtonian level.
Thank you. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. I think the fact that you struggle to explain to your designer how to animate all of this really makes a big point about all of this in itself. Kobus, thank you very much once again. There's a bottle of wine for you.
Ja, ek het hom voor die tyd gehad het.